I see that specifically when it comes to battery operated cars, there are legitimate arguments about the type of mining that's done in the destruction of the world as it relates to the ability to get resources such as cobalt, and there's a finite amount of lithium that the batteries are also made from. And the mining that's done, which they've even showed pictures, is quite questionable as a converts the benefit that the battery operated car is supposed to provide.
On the other end of the spectrum, you have those irredeemable, really what I call the unsustainable companies. So those are the industries that, unless they totally change what they do or shut down, there's no way they can be sustainable. They kill their end user, right? So you can't be sustainable. When you kill your end user, it violates human rights. So that's right out of the gate. You can't be sustainable.
All right, this is another episode of Verbal Artwork with Mr. Rembrandt. Of course, I'm Mr. Rembrandt, and we have a special guest here today. We have John Pabon, and John Pabon is an expert who's spent 2 decades in sustainability. He's traveled the globe from LA to New York, Shanghai to Seoul, and Seoul to Melbourne, where he's currently at. He's worked for the UN, Fortune 500 companies, McKinsey and AC Nelson, if I'm understood correctly. Again, he's considered an expert on the topic of sustainability. So this is a juicy topic. We're going to get into a lot of different things about the ecosystem, about the earth, about sustainability, plastic, recycles, batteries, different things. We're going to have a nice juicy deep dive. And he's published a book as well called Sustainability for the Rest of Us. So, John, without further ado, glad you can make it on the show. If you want to introduce yourself a little bit, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. No, you did a really good introduction, but I've spent, like you said, about 2 decades now in this field. I got started probably before it was even called sustainability. It was called like CSR. So have been working in this field for quite a long time, but I think, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, I have a little bit of a different take on building change. And I think a lot of that comes from me working and spending most of my career in places like China, doing a lot of work across Asia. So that's where the majority of my professional experience has been, which is a totally different approach to building a better future than maybe it is in the United States or Europe. I have another book out as well that was just released in the United States in March called The Great Greenwashing. So we'll get into that, I'm sure, today as well. And the rest of my time, I just spend trying to get the word out about what people can do in very practical, easy ways to actually make a difference. And I spend a lot of my time working with corporations as well, helping them on their sustainability strategies. So a bit about me.
Sounds good. Really good. So before we dive right in, let's just stick our toe in a little bit. And I'd just like to know a little bit more about your background, particularly what made you stumble down this career path? Is this something you wanted to do from a child? Is this something that your career made you stumble upon? What were your beginnings and how did you get directly to this?
It was an accident, actually, getting into sustainability itself, but I've always wanted to be in kind of the public good area. So started my career at the United Nations. That was always sort of my thing. Even when I worked in consulting with McKinsey and Nielsen, I worked with their public sector clients. So still in that public good kind of space. I studied international affairs and politics. So again, public good, even though some people wouldn't say politicians are good, some of them can be. But I took a trip to Shanghai it would have been 2008, and really enjoyed my time there. I went back to New York where I was living at the time. That's the height of the global financial crisis, and it was not a fun place to be. But Shanghai was kind of the polar opposite, so I thought, let's pack up the bags and go over to Shanghai. And landing there, and for anybody who hasn't been to Shanghai, it's kind of capitalism on steroids. Like, you don't get a more capitalist city than maybe Shanghai, and I couldn't do my public sector work that I had developed all of that experience in because it just doesn't go there. So I fell into sustainability, which for me is kind of the marriage of doing public good, altruism, working with public sector clients, but doing it in a way that impacts the private sector, so corporations, so kind of the mix of the two. And the rest is history. I've been in the space now, like I said, going on almost 20 years, and all because of a little accident, because I decided to take a trip to Shanghai.
Nice, nice. And I haven't been to Shanghai yet, but I do remember seeing a video of a nomad traveler that was critiquing New York City and says there are many cities around the world that actually have New York City beats. And, he's named some things like Tokyo, maybe Shanghai is one. And yeah, so that's very interesting. So if a company was to call on you for your expertise, what would that look like?
So the majority of companies that come to me, and they're of all different sizes. So when I started my consultancy back in 2017, I thought, okay, I'll keep working with the big guys and just do their sustainability strategies. But interestingly, a lot of smaller and medium businesses also approached me. Very different reasons as to why, but they're all approaching me for sort of the same thing, which is looking at how they strategize and operationalize sustainability, how they make it make sense to their business, how they make it profitable for their business, because there's no reason why we can't talk about doing good and making money. You kind of have to talk about that when it comes to business. And then making sure that all of that is communicated out the right way so that they're not lying to the public, they're not overstating their claims, and they can actually improve over time. And I know I'm sure there's people listening going, oh, corporations suck, they're not doing anything. But a lot of them, especially the big ones, are doing a lot. They just tend not to talk about it very much, which I'm working to get them to stop. When it comes to the smaller and medium-sized businesses, they're looking at it slightly differently because they understand that if they ever want to sell their business, they need to have sustainability inside their operations and strategies, and investors love to see when they have that built in. So a little bit of a different rationale as to why they're approaching me, but at the end of the day, the result is the same. A strong sustainability strategy that actually makes an impact for the business and for the planet.
Good, good. So what are some work that you've done with, let's say, some of the larger companies to use some of these sustainability tactics and strategies to help benefit them? You have a particular story or two that you've taken a company from point A to point B and we're helping them with sustainability?
My favorite example to give, because it's kind of a shocking example for a lot of people, is my work I did with Walmart. So a lot of people, especially in the United States, look at Walmart and they go, oh, that's Satan incarnate. That's the world's worst company. And yeah, they're not great. They do a lot of bad things, especially when it comes to, labor practices in the United States. We know that. But in their work across the developing world, especially in China, they're doing really amazing things when it comes to worker betterment programs. And I think it's probably important to back up just one step and kind of define what we're talking about with sustainability, because people probably have 100 different ideas of what we mean. But sustainability is this umbrella term for anything that builds a better future for the planet or for people. So that could be the green environmental side of things, which is important and it gets the lion's share of the PR, but it's only one part of everything we do. There's an entire other practice that looks at more of the social side of things. So human rights, labor rights, supply chain and logistics, even animal rights are built in there as well. So that's a big part of the work that we do. The work I was doing with Walmart, and this was when I was a consultant with BSR, who's kind of the McKinsey of the sustainability world. We went into their factories, they have about 60 across China, and we looked at how do we develop a program to help particularly female workers upskill themselves in things like communication skills, financial literacy, personal health and wellness, all these things that maybe they wouldn't have gotten in school, but are still really important from the perspective of just doing good by people. Now, you can't go into the Walmart team and say, hey, we want you to do this kumbaya stuff with your employees because it's the right thing to do. They'll laugh us out of the room. But the way we approached it and the actual draw was for a lot of people in the developing world, especially in China, things like abortion that's considered a form of family planning, right? But if you have at any one time, let's say half of your workforce is female, a quarter of them are out at any one time, either recovering from a procedure or having a procedure, your production's going to go down. When people do get back to work, they're probably not going to be as happy to be there or as productive. So overall, your profitability goes down. And for some people listening, you're probably thinking, how could you talk about doing good for people and money at the same time? But these are the kind of conversations that need to be had with boards of directors, or else they're never going to listen to you. So we went in with that proposition saying, hey, you teach these different skills, you show that there are other options, and all of a sudden, your workers are happy, they're healthier, they're showing up to work more because they're not out having procedures. They like you a lot more because you're showing that you care, and all of a sudden the profitability for all the factories goes up. And because of the scale of Walmart, and we'll talk about this in a sec as to why I work with the private sector, we're not talking about like 10 or 20 women going through this program. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of women going through this program over the course of its 3 years. So massive amounts of scale and positive impact. And I think when it comes to the private sector, and the reason I work with them, is because they have this capital scale ability to do these things that a lot of individuals and governments can't because they don't have it. I mean, you look at things like, I think the latest statistics is something like Netflix is larger than the economy of Mozambique. So these are their own countries, right? So you work with them because they have this ability to scale and make a massive positive impact. So I think that's my favorite story. It gets a lot of people scratching their heads, especially when you talk about Walmart being a good corporation, but they do good things. Not always. They're not perfect, but some things are all right.
No, very good. It's good to see that with sustainability, it's multifaceted. It's not just about everything green, so to speak. You're looking at the well-beings of the individual workers and how that relates to the bottom line of a company. So no, that's good that there's some economic aspect to it as well, because some would argue that there are some disparate comparisons when it comes to the benefit that fundamental green tactics or techniques that are being used to help the economy or the world rather is not wrapped around financially smart or efficient aspects such as solar and aspects of battery operated cars. The way I describe it is it's kind of the 9/11 argument. And what I mean by that is, just hear me out. In the history books, we will always correlate it as a terrorist attack, which it was. But then there's this highly compelling other side of the argument to where it was this inside job, right? So when it comes to the aspect of green efficiency and how it can help society and its financial appeal, there's one argument where there are so many things you can do to help the world, help the economy. And then on the other hand, well, it's just so much more expensive than any of the other energy out there that exists, except maybe nuclear. So shifting a little bit from what you do and companies that you've helped and benefit, let's dive deep into some of these topics specifically. So there's a hot topic, for example, ESG going around. And could you explain that really quick and give what your opinion of ESG is? Because I'm pretty sure with what you do, it has to overlap in some way, shape, or form.
So ESG is just another name for sustainability. That's basically what it is. So we talk about sustainability to kind of the general public, right? We use that word. But inside sustainability, and for anybody who practices it, we've always used the acronym ESG, which just stands for environment, so the green side, social, which is kind of what I was talking about with Walmart, and governance, which is more of where I spend the majority of my time now, which is looking at how primarily corporations, but also governments, how we're tracking what they're doing, how we operationalize it and make sure we're holding them to account. So ESG is the same thing, essentially, as sustainability. Where people see it used most often publicly is ESG as a term that investors or the financial markets use. They tend to use it more than anything else. And I know particularly in the US and the EU, ESG has, I don't know if it's gotten a bad rap just yet, but there's certainly pushback against it because of some of the issues you mentioned earlier, especially around the economics of ESG and how it is a cost. It's always been a cost. Sustainability, doing the right thing, is always cost more for corporations, for individual consumers. We know that when we go to the store and we have to spend more for the right product. So long answer to your short question, ESG is the same thing as sustainability. I'm, given what I do, obviously pro ESG, pro sustainability. But I think from a communications perspective, we've always had a problem getting the message across in a good way. It doesn't matter if it's ESG, that's the latest incarnation of bad communications, or just getting people to understand what it is they can actually do to make a difference. We've always had a communications problem. I think ESG is just now at the forefront of that, where people maybe have a misunderstanding of what it is or loaded understanding of what it can and cannot do. I think overall, the way we can contextualize sustainability, building a better future, all that sort of stuff, is not necessarily flipping a switch and black and white, because I think a lot of people think, okay, if we do this, there will be a positive impact, it'll be automatic, but that's kind of not what we're talking about. We're talking about incremental change. We're talking about moving the needle in the right direction. So the way I look at everything when it comes to building a better future is not have we accomplished 100% of what we're trying to do, but have we moved the needle the right way because it is so slow moving. We're talking centuries, right, to build a better future. So use the example of electric vehicles, which is a great one, where today people know that electric vehicles are not perfect. They're not great. They have horrible supply chain issues, especially when it comes to rare earth minerals. They're not great. But are they better than a gas-guzzling combustion engine from the 1950s? Yeah, 100%. So the needle moved in the right direction. And because it has, now companies in the automotive sector, they're looking at, okay, we know EVs aren't perfect. What can we do that's even better than that? How can we continue to move the needle in the right direction? And that's kind of what we want to see. I think the more we expect things to be perfect and to push for that, especially the more activisty sort of mindset, which I don't have, but you have to do it now, you have to shut this all down. It's naive, A, it's not realistic, B, but it doesn't really get people involved in making that change, because if you're not seeing immediate impact, then you're going to give up. But you change your mindset a little bit and say, oh, yeah, it's not perfect, but it's going in the right direction. I think that's a much better, healthier mindset to have when it comes to doing the work that we do, which is already waking up pushing crap uphill to begin with, so why make it even more stressful than it already is?
Good. So ESG is another term for sustainability, which is what you do. Because I've heard arguments on both sides with the connotations around ESG. You know, when some people mention ESG, they think of maybe Charles Schwab, and they'll even go as far as say things like maybe the Great Reset. There are also the avenue that you take where ESG is a good term geared towards sustainability and a brighter future for the world and all the people in it. Where do you think the incorrect connotations are out there about ESG? And where do you think even the cons are when it comes to ESG, where they've maybe taken it too far a little bit?
Yeah, it's interesting. And coming out of the UN system in particular, the UN system is rife with conspiracy theories about the stuff that the UN is trying to do, New World Order, all these sort of things. And for anybody listening that sort of believes that, the UN has a hard time organizing a picnic. They can't organize a New World Order. So don't worry about the UN. I'm not saying that these things aren't happening with others. Maybe there is an organization doing that, the Illuminati, I don't know, but it's not the UN. So don't worry about them, focus somewhere else. But when it comes to sustainability, we go to this comment I made earlier about the bad communications. And it started way back when we started talking about sustainability, which would have been the early 1960s. We usually talk about 1962 as being the start of the environmental movement, because that's when Rachel Carson released Silent Spring, her seminal book. But since then, we've done a pretty terrible job at bringing people along the ride with us. Like, you look at some of the traditional messaging that goes into sustainability. You look at the things like the polar bear on the melting ice cap. You look at the poor girl in some far-off country that you can save for the price of a cup of coffee. All these sort of things that we see on television or we've heard for decades. But if you're just one of 10 billion people sitting watching that commercial on TV, you sort of scratch your head and go, well, what does that have to do with me, A? And B, what am I supposed to do if I'm just one of 10 billion people? I can't do anything about it. So I think that is a really good starting point for getting conspiracy theories or misunderstandings going, because it's either the mindset right now, and it has been for decades, is either you're with us or you're against us. And people don't like being put in that position. So the way I always approach talking about sustainability is less the the angry vegan sort of model. I'm not a vegan, but you know what I'm talking about, where a vegan lets you know when they're a vegan. And if you're not a vegan, you're in trouble and you probably don't want to talk to them. I think we need to change that approach where it's more, okay, this is what you can actually do. If you don't want to do this, do that. Come along the ride with us and don't feel like you have to do everything. Don't feel like you have a proverbial gun to your head to force you to do this. I think anytime people feel like they're forced to do something, there's going to be a million different ways they push back. And part of that is willfully or maybe unknowingly misunderstanding what's going on, having a negative impression. We do really good at having negative impressions of the things we do, especially when it comes to a lot of the more vocal folks in the sustainability movement. I'm thinking of these activist groups that throw tomato soup at paintings, right? Like if you're seeing that on television and you're going, okay, that's what this is about, is throwing tomato soup on paintings. I don't want to be associated with that. I'm not going to, be with those people. So it just makes it even more difficult to bring people on side. I think today, particularly with all of our communications issues, the thing we should be doing, those of us that want to bring more people on side, is less about raising awareness. I think people know there's something going on, even if they don't agree as to the how and why it's happening, and they may not agree with statistics. Some people may go as far as to say they don't believe that climate change is happening at all. That's fine. But the awareness is somehow there of what's happening. Now it's showing people what they can do to make a difference if they want, or if they're against all of this sort of stuff, sitting down and actually have a conversation. Remember when we used to do that? We used to have conversations with people, right? Versus just screaming at them because you're entrenched in your sort of bubble. Like, that's not the way to approach this stuff. Sit down and talk to people, and you'll be surprised what you actually agree on.
Yeah, so that's good. Would you, if you're looking at the future, I would hope you would say the future is more bright than not, right? And as we move forward, is the goal net zero, or is the goal a happy medium and a life where we balance out the combination of all of these sources of energy? Because I'll give you my perspective and then I'll let you answer that. I see that specifically when it comes to the battery operated cars, there are legitimate arguments about the type of mining that's done in the destruction of the world as it relates to the ability to get resources such as cobalt, and there's a finite amount of lithium that the batteries are also made from. And the mining that's done, which they've even showed pictures, is quite questionable as the benefit that the battery operated cars is supposed to provide. And then at the same time, there's some argument about the computational power that a battery operated vehicle in its current state can provide compared to a gasoline vehicle. Although they are getting a lot better than that, there's a few battery operated supercars that they've made that seem to be unimaginable. But nevertheless, as far as I'm concerned, the battery operated car seems to be something that will be harmonious with our ever growing world, but I don't think it will grow farther than maybe 30% of the whole entire vehicle market. I think the future will still be more gasoline operated than battery. And as far as net zero, I think my perspective is, as we move forward, us as Western societies have become more aware of our carbon emissions and taken the steps to lower those carbon emissions. And it's a matter of more of these countries that are second, third world to get on board once they meet a sustainability to start reducing their carbon emissions, due to the fact that these main natural resources are a lot cheaper, right? So based upon all of what I said, what do you think about the future of battery operated vehicles and the goal towards net zero, if that is the goal? And so what is your argument?
So, we talked a little bit ago about electric vehicles and kind of how, they're horrendous in a lot of ways, and people are realizing that. But better than what we had before. And I agree with you that we're not going to be getting rid of traditional engines and cars anytime soon in any meaningful way, even though there's legislation around the world in different countries to do so. It's still going to be a sizable portion. But the interesting thing about that is, since we've now got to electric vehicles, and I think last year Toyota was the last car brand to put an electric vehicle anywhere in their line. So I think now every major car brand has some sort of an electric vehicle. So if you think about it from a pure capitalistic business perspective, now that everybody has one, that's not a competitive advantage anymore. It's not a differentiator. So I don't work with automotive brands, but I do talk to automotive brands. I know that some of the big ones are now looking at, okay, if EVs are no longer competitive, differentiating, and they're problematic, what else can we do? So they're looking at things like hydrogen, for example. Some are actually looking at, how do we totally divest from automotive altogether and do investments in public transportation? So these conversations are starting to happen now, where 15 years ago, we would have never thought that these things could happen. So that's that incremental change, which goes to your second point of things like net zero, what the future looks like. And the future is bright. I know a lot of people don't think it is. There's lots of doom and gloom out there, but it is going in the right direction. But what's not going to happen is we're not going to all give up our cell phones, trips to Thailand, and go live on a farm somewhere. That's not happening, right? I think a lot of people have a misunderstanding of what we're trying to do, and it's not, maybe some people want to, but for the majority of us that are realistic, that's not what's going to happen. We're not going back to agrarian society. We are where we are, right? This is the state of being that humanity is in. I'm not giving up my cell phone. I like to go on a plane to go on trips, and I'm somebody that would count myself as an environmentalist. So I don't expect everybody else to be doing things like going and living off the grid. So that's not what's going to happen. But what will happen is this transition, which is already happening now, of adapting to a changing world. So things are changing, weather patterns are changing, the world's heating up, but the world will be here. We will be here as well. So how do we begin to coexist in a much more meaningful way between the two? So that's requiring adaptations that we're already seeing. You see things like seawalls, for example, or ways to address changing weather patterns. So that stuff's already happening. Things like net zero, but I count net zero sort of as a buzzword. So that's an entirely different thing. I mean, when you kick the can over to 2050 as a politician, that just means you don't really care that much, because it's not your problem anymore. But that's a totally separate issue. When it comes to things like what nations are doing, though, individual countries, I think and this goes to what I was saying at the very beginning of my approach to sustainability, so it's good we're on this now. In the developed world, we'll call it that, North America, Europe, sustainability is very much an academic conversation, right? You see panels and conferences, you talk about it, but it's still kind of at arm's length. But if you go to the developing world, again, where have spent the majority of my working experience, sustainability is very much front and center every day in everything that you do. For those of us in the profession, we have to roll our sleeves up and actually get dirty. We have to be in these factories in far off places somewhere in the developing world that we probably don't want to be in. But we do it because we love what we do. If you're an individual person, every day you walk out your door, you're breathing in pollution, you're drinking dirty water. These things are, your home is now underwater, so you have to find a place to move because the river flooded its banks. So these things are front and center for you, and I think because of that, people in the developing world are probably a bit more switched on as to A, the impacts of climate change, but B, what needs to be done to make positive change. Whereas, again, it's still sort of arm's length, blah, 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 that's happening over there. It's not our issue. But all of this to say, remember, we're all in the same rock, and we're all floating through space on the same place. But these systems of, let's talk about consumerism, it's holistic, right? It's not this country bad, this country good, this country's doing the wrong thing, and this country's doing the right thing, because at the end of the day, those things that are purchased in the US, for example, I want a new iPhone because my other iPhone is 4 months old and I need a new one. That means that somewhere in the developing world, that's having an impact. Your decision is having, proverbial you, is having an impact over in the developing world because somebody has to make that, which then creates the pollution, which then gets spit out into the atmosphere on this rock that we're all cohabitating on. So it's not as easy as just saying that's their problem to deal with, not ours, because we're all in this together. I know that sounds kumbaya-ish, but it's the reality of the global supply chains. Somebody's decision in Los Angeles is impacting 10 billion people around the world. So all of that to say, be smarter, I think, with how you consume, be more conscious of the ways you consume. And had I said this a year ago, I would have laughed at myself. But I've really come to embrace this idea that how you spend your money makes such a massive difference, because where you're spending or not spending is going to influence what businesses do, how they perform, how they act, and ultimately whether or not we're building a better future for people and planet. And it makes sense too, because in these economic times, you don't want to be wasting your money. So I always advocate for quality over quantity.
No, that's great. And I noticed from already from talking to you that you do take a balance. It appears that you take a balanced approach to your overall perspective when addressing these issues. You know, you make the argument how you believe that politicians shouldn't kick the can down the road for the next guy. And just because we are in the more advanced Western world, for example, that it doesn't mean we have zero responsibility, even though there could be other countries doing a lot worse than us. And then at the same time, when you do make your arguments, you actually add in a lot of qualifiers to not demonize and make negative suppositions directly targeted at the big companies. For example, you seem to definitely take a really objective perspective. So it does.
Some are terrible. Don't worry. I talk a lot about that in the great greenwashing. There are some irredeemable industries. I mean, the oil, gas, mining, defense, and tobacco are the ones that, unless they shut their doors or entirely change their business model, I mean, at the end of the day, when your business is about harming people, you can't be sustainable. So those are irredeemable. But I think for the majority of other industries that are out there, there's glimmers of hope, some more than others. So I try to hold on to that as much as possible. But for those that are irredeemable, I honestly, I don't waste my time working with them, because they're not going to change until we shut them down. So I'll leave that to the younger activists to handle those companies.
Yeah. So do you think, you said some of those companies are irredeemable? Do you think that, well, why is that? What are some of those companies that you believe, for example, that you might say are kind of net negative?
Yeah, so it's the ones that, I mean, the ones I mentioned, it's just that handful. And in doing the research for the Great Greenwashing, I looked at different industries and I thought, okay, we assume there's like hundreds of different industry sectors, but really there's only like 20. There's only so many. And on one end of the scale, you have those that are usually very regulated. So medical, medtech, finance, that the government's really always on them, watching them. They tend to be a little bit better because they have to be. Again, they're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. Like the financial sector is quite bad when it comes to funding ungreen things, but they're more regulated, so they tend to be a bit better. On the other end of the spectrum, you have those irredeemable, really what I call the unsustainable companies, which are, there's four. So oil, gas, defense, and tobacco. So those are the industries that, unless they totally change what they do or shut down, there's no way they can be sustainable. Defense and tobacco, as an example, since they essentially, I mean, they kill their end user, right? So you can't be sustainable when you kill your end user. It violates human rights. So that's right out of the gate. You can't be sustainable. Oil, gas, and mining have spent decades really trying to work against building a sustainable future. The products they produce, the industry they're in, is just so antithetical to building a green future. With that said, I understand very well, and this goes to that balanced perspective you were talking about. I appreciate that. That we need, in today's day and age, we need industries like oil and gas and mining, because we can't do without them. The products we use, even to the point of needing plastics in medical technology. We need this stuff because we haven't innovated beyond it yet. So I understand for the time being, they're a necessary evil. I think that that's fine. I know as well that particularly when it comes to oil and those types of companies, they are looking at ways of transitioning into more cleaner energies. So why they're doing that is going to be a million different reasons. I think the majority of them, it's because they realize that there's such consumer pushback, that the public perception of being an oil company today is a bad one. So they want to look at ways of diversifying a bit more because they see the writing on the wall that a century from now they're not going to be around. So they're looking more strategically at how they diversify. But again, for the time being, we need these companies, and so that's fine. I would encourage those companies to look at ways to diversify and change what it is they're doing so that they are changing their business model. So that's why those companies are irredeemable, as I would call them. But the rest of the other, 12, 15 different industry sectors, they're somewhere in the middle. Some are better than others. Some are doing more than others. But the majority of them kind of sit in this middle space where they're doing good things, they're improving and becoming more sustainable, but they're far from perfect. So lots of work still to be done.
Okay, so before we move into the next topic, I would ask, what specifically about the oil and gas companies are so bad?
So when it comes to oil and gas, for example, the use of fossil fuels is one of the number one contributors to climate change and global warming. So that's been confirmed by, I think it's 98%.
It's not human activity?
Well, human activity because of what the oil and gas industry is doing. So the oil and gas industry is run by humans, and that is a major contributor to when we talk about human activity. That's part of it. But to what I'm assuming you're trying to get at, it's all of our individual performance as well in what we're doing, right? So yes, these companies produce things like fossil fuels, but it's all of us that then put that fossil fuel into our cars that we drive around. So again, this idea that everything's a big holistic cycle, that everything is impacted by everything else, that goes into that. So when we talk about man-made climate change, which 98% of scientists believe is the case, that's part of what we're talking about. So industry, what industry is doing. But when it comes to oil and gas, and we can also lump in agriculture and construction, they're highly polluting as well. So those three industries taken together are the ones that release the vast majority of carbon emissions into the atmosphere, which is causing climate change. Again, these companies are also looking at ways of improving what they're doing so they don't release those things so that we can slow down any sort of climate change that's going on. So a lot of people assume that, climate change can't be slowed down or stopped, but it certainly can be, which is what things like the net zero commitments companies are making and countries are making, big things happening out of the United Nations at an international level. It's all meant to slow down this rate of change in the hopes of we're never going to stop the change, right? It's already happening. But how can we make it not as bad for everybody, especially for future generations, as it could potentially be? That's kind of the goal. So back to your original question, what is it about these oil and gas and mining companies? It's because they're releasing and providing to individual consumers ways to release different carbon emissions into the atmosphere.
Yeah. So would you say that, just to use an analogy, I would say, I'm pretty eclectic, so I like a lot of different things, movies and sports. And so I use different metaphors and analogies to make different points. One particular sports analogy is there's a dramatic and drastic change for how basketball is being played in the NBA, for example. And one of the changes is that a lot of tall men, 6'9", 6'10", 6'11", 7-footers, the traditional way of playing basketball is where they were down low. They can grab rebounds, they can push guys around, they can dunk the ball very easily. Now the shift is that a lot of these big guys are learning how to shoot at very good rates, and they're standing out on the perimeter and they're shooting a lot of threes. And this is actually allowing NBA teams to score more points on average than previous decades and seasons. But also what it does do, take away is now if you are relying on three-point shooting and shooting from the perimeter, especially as a big man, this leaves you down low, open for not being able to rebound, not being able to take that aggressive offensive and defensive way to dunk the basketball and clear the paint and dominate the paint. So my observation of that is, okay, yes, I see the benefit, and I also see the traditional benefit of having a big man is the most useful by using his size and being big. And so when the younger generations look at the game of basketball, they will associate that having a big man shooting threes is what you're supposed to do. And my perspective will always be, well, in actuality, being down low is more use of somebody who's that big rather than being on the outside shooting threes, no matter how good he is. So I make that argument to make that moving forward, there seems to be a lot of more contentious perspectives about all of the traditional ways that have moved us forward in society. And I used an argument of using myself as one of those proponents of the sports analogy. And there's things become trendy, and even things that are beneficial or things that are technological. And there's this push to change, or you're wrong, or change, or you're bad. And do you believe that there's a lot of somewhat negativity around your industry or that industry, and why you feel like you need to qualify certain things and qualify them both for the good, to say, you know, hey, all industries aren't bad, and then also qualify for things for the bad, where you say, well, listen, these industries are terrible in these different ways, but I do understand they are necessary. So what is your observation of that?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I love the analogy, the basketball analogy too, because especially the point you made about how future generations will look at the game as if that's how it's always been, when those of us that are watching it now or have watched it in the past will go, no, that's not how it's always been. And it's the same thing with any sort of sports. You look at the Olympics, and, you know, there's that great story about the first person who ever ran, was it a sub 4-minute mile? Where, you know, beforehand people thought that absolutely impossible. There's no way somebody at the first Olympics in the late 1800s would have thought anybody could run a mile in under 7 minutes. But these things change, and it changes the nature of the game. And I think when it comes to sustainability and the things that we do, probably a lot of the reason why I tend to, especially in public forums like this, qualify things a bit more is because that balanced, qualified conversation really hasn't happened, right? It's always been so extreme one way or the other, particularly from more activists that are just yelling at the top of their lungs, but aren't necessarily really strategic. So I think having a little bit more balanced voice it's necessary because it's an empty space, but I think it's the right way to approach this stuff as well, because it's not easy. Like the work that I do in trying to build a better future is not flipping a switch. It's so highly nuanced and intricate and matrixed that there is no other way to talk about being balanced, because there is good, there is bad, there is things in the middle. One of the things we tend not to talk about too much outside the industry, but to just the general public, is a concept that we call a just transition. Just meaning like a good transition. And what that means, and I've teased it out a bit in the chat we've had, is we're in a transitional phase, right? Things are not going to just change overnight. We're not going to just get rid of highly polluting industries. We're not just going to go live on a farm. And because things need to be done in a just, equitable manner, it makes it a lot more complicated. We'll use the oil and gas industry again as an example. If the activists got their way and they shut down oil and gas tomorrow, great, they would have been successful. But it's a very naive take, because like I said, we need oil and gas for a lot of the things that we have that help us to survive. But what do you do with all those millions, and millions is probably a bit of an exaggeration, tens of thousands of people who are going to be out of a job that have no other skills? How are they going to make an income? What do you do with them? What do you do with all of the infrastructure that's left over? You just leave it there crumbling? You can't do that, because then that releases carbon into the atmosphere. So it's not as easy as just saying, shut your doors, you're bad. So I think that's why I take a little bit more of a balanced approach to these things, because I have seen the need in my experience, and maybe that's because I've spent it in the developing world, I don't know. But I've seen the need to be a little bit more measured with what's going on versus just yelling at the top of your lungs and saying, shut it down, We've done that for long enough. We've done it for 60 plus years, and it's not really helped. So maybe it's time for a different approach versus just yelling at people and throwing tomato soup at a painting. I think it is.
Yes. So yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I do appreciate that approach. I mean, that's really good.
Well, and hopefully,
So
you know, in 100 years' time, using your basketball analogy, people will look at the world and say, oh, this is the way we do things, and this must be how it's always been. But for today, you know, we don't get it that way. And I give this, actually, this is a really good segue into this example. You know, a lot of people, they go to the store and they want to do the right thing, but it costs more to buy the good product, right? Or God forbid you have to do research to find a company that's doing a good thing when you get to the store. Nobody wants to do that. I don't want to do that. I don't want to pull out my phone and research every product I'm going to buy before I buy it. Of course not. But it's the unfortunate reality that we're living in, that we have to do that now if you want to make a good decision, if that's your choice. But given the things I've seen behind the scenes with corporations and what's happening, I would say 10 or 15 years from now, hopefully sooner rather than later, when you go to the store to buy your stuff, all the products will be good, sustainable products at a good price point, because businesses will have done the hard work already. So all you need to do as a consumer is make a decision and buy a product. And a lot of the things that are going on now, especially with the way the capitalist system is, and again, I said a minute ago that businesses will respond to what the market wants. The market's demanding better for the planet, better for people products. So because of that, the dinosaurs that refuse to do the right thing today are not going to be around much longer. The system will take care of them. So again, 10, 15 years time, the majority of companies will be good, at least consumer-facing companies will be good, and the majority of products that you have to select from will be good products. And maybe that will change that dynamic. So back to your basketball analogy, where 15 years from now, people will go to the store and say, hey, I'm so glad that everything I'm buying is a good for the planet, good for people product. I assume that this is the way it's always been, even though those of us alive today know that that's not the way it's always been.
So there's also some arguments. I'll just ask you this question, and maybe we'll do one more question or so, and then I know your time's valuable. I'll go ahead and let you go. But we made an argument about carbon dioxide, for example, and human activity. And you alluded that, you know, part of the human activity is the production of carbon dioxide through these various industries that we have. And what I was alluded to, what you probably understand, is some would argue that the sheer amount of population on the planet is harming the globe, so to speak. I tend to disagree, but I might be a little bit more optimistic than other people. But my argument and my question is, the argument about carbon dioxide is that, okay, yes, it's raising the temperature, approximately 2% over the last 100 years, and this is causing drastic effects. Polar ice caps are melting in a lot of different areas. And then the latter argument is that in some areas, the ice caps are actually growing, and around the equator in different areas as well, there's more greenery being produced as a result of more carbon dioxide that exists in the atmosphere. So some would argue that there is a shift that's occurring as a result of climate change, right? Which is, I think, it's a more appropriate definition of what's occurring rather than an apocalypse or some of these other definitions that are used. And my perspective is, which you can give your argument, is that over the course of the Earth's existence, which is over 4 billion years, there's probably been a lot of different shifts that the world goes through and cycles over the course of a long term. What do you think about that?
No, you're absolutely right. And I don't ascribe to the doom and gloom model. So this apocalyptic model, I don't believe is the right thing to do. And funny enough, when I do say I'm not a doom and gloomer, that is a very...
Or an alarmist? Would you say that too?
I'm not an alarmist. Not at all. I'm not an alarmist. And I'm sure that's you can figure that out just by the way I'm talking. But in the sustainability world, I would be considered extreme for having that position. So a lot of my sustainability colleagues look at me not being an alarmist and going, what the F is wrong with you, John? What is going on? So I'm actually on the extreme end of things from not wanting to scare the crap out of people. But all of that to say, yes, things are changing. We talked about that already. We're having to adapt. It's happening, right? So, but that doesn't mean that we need to think the sky is falling, because the Earth will survive. Whether or not we do, I hope we do. I think we will. But there's no reason to be alarmed. And I think the more we scare people, and it goes back to this idea of really bad communications and messaging, the more you scare people, the less likely they are to do something that's going to be positively impactful, right? If I scare you into thinking the Earth's going to blow up tomorrow, what's the point of doing anything today? So I don't like to take that alarmist perspective, and I am actually teasing out an idea for a third book if I have the energy, which would be all about not being an alarmist. So that's maybe coming up in the next year or two. We'll see. So I think it's really important to again just be realistic about where things are going. But to the more sciencey stuff, and I'll qualify this by saying I'm not a scientist. There are plenty of scientists in the sustainability field. That's just not my area of expertise. But generally speaking, though, what we're looking at in the examples you gave are individualized sort of things happening around the world, and the way we need to look at climate change, which is the right phrase to use, versus global warming, which is another thing, but it has different connotation. Climate change overall, we want to look at what's happening overall across the entire world, right? So how things are impacting melting ice caps, how things are impacting more ice caps, which, may sound for some people like it's a good thing that there's more ice caps happening, but that also has negative repercussions, right? So historically, yes, we know the Earth goes through cycles, but the difference with this particular cycle that we're in is the rapidity, how fast it's happening, right? Versus maybe the last ice age, which took a few different millennia to actually happen. This is happening over the course of, it's been less than 150 years that we've seen these changes. So I think that's what the alarming part is for those in the science part of sustainability, is just how fast it's happening. And that's the key differentiator this time around versus all the other cycles that we've seen throughout history. So, but I really do like that you're using this idea of climate change versus just global warming. I think everything goes back to communications, doesn't it? I think we need to be using that a little bit more because it's easier for people to understand. And I think as well, when it comes to doing anything positive and making change, the issue we're facing now is not just the alarmists, but it seems so big, right? Like the problem seems just insurmountable. Like, what are we supposed to do about all this stuff? But if we start to break things down into their individual pieces and then make that relatable to individual people and what they can do, it doesn't seem so big. And I'm not saying the problems aren't big. Obviously they are, right? These are massive issues that we're facing, but the worst thing we can do is just sit back and say, can't do anything, or it's somebody else's problem. We hear a lot this phrase, we're building a better future today for future generations. That sort of idea. But no, we're the future generation. We're the ones they were talking about. So I think it's really important that we start to do something today. And there are plenty of people, plenty of corporations, and some governments, I wish there were more, actually doing things to slow down a lot of the climate change that is happening so that we can at least be able to adapt to it. The faster this stuff happens, the less likely we are to be able to innovate and protect ourselves as a species, which is also one of the alarming parts, right? So if you have 1,000 years to prepare, that's a long time to innovate and to prepare yourself. But if we only have 20 years before things get really, really bad, it's not a lot of time to have the brightest minds in the world innovate and do something. There's only so many Elon Musks. As problematic as he is, he has made some change.
John, great episode. Refreshing to talk to you. Your objective opinion, you've definitely don't shy away of saying what you believe to be true and honest, and criticize what's important, but also give credit where credit is due, whether it's different sectors or what people can do or different industries and how we're moving forward. Definitely refreshing conversation. It was great to talk to you. And you said the future is bright. I think the future is bright. And any closing remarks on the overall conversation, and any words to the viewers about the future at hand?
No, I call myself a pragmatic altruist. So altruist meaning, I care, I wear my heart on my sleeve, I want everybody to do better and to be good, but I do it pragmatically, right? I do it strategically. I look at things realistically and from where we're starting, not trying to create some false sense of what we can do. And I just would encourage everybody to do a little bit more of that as well. There are plenty of people around the world that care, but those of us that do, it seems like we need to do it all. And you don't need to. Look at strategically the stuff you're doing. Look at what impact it's having and really turn the mirror on yourself and say, hey, yeah, I like doing this stuff, but is there something I can do that's even more impactful than what I'm doing now? And rest assured, there are millions of other people around the world picking up where maybe you can't, and that's okay. No such thing as a perfect environmentalist. You don't have to do it all.
Yeah. What do you think about Bijan Lombard or Michael Schellenberger? Are you familiar with those two?
No, those are two brand new names.
Really? All right. Well, it's a great episode. So I'll definitely put your book in the notes, showroom notes at the end of the episode in the description. And I'll put any of your links also in the description. And John, excellent episode. Glad you could be on Verbal Artwork with Mr. Rembrandt, where words paint pictures and pictures is art and conversation is art. So
thank you so much for having me. It was really, really great.
Yes. No, thank you. Thank you, John.